The crutch hit the ground before the scream did. It clattered once, then slid across the smooth tile, spinning end over end like a discarded weapon. The girl collapsed in a heap, her right leg folding beneath her, her hands scraping against the floor. Gasps filled the corridor. A phone dropped. Someone muttered "what the" before cutting themselves off, but the man who kicked it, he didn't flinch. He just stood over her, arms crossed, smug smirk twisting up one side of his face. His black boots squeaked as he shifted his weight. A security badge clung to his chest, tilted, half-unclipped, like even his own uniform didn't want to belong to him. And 10 steps away, a figure stood frozen in the doorway. Older, gray beard, sun-creased face, Jason Statham. He didn't say a word. Because someone else was already rising from the bench across the lobby, slowly, like a shadow being pulled from the floor. Steven Seagal. But 2 hours earlier, that hallway had been filled with silence and sunlight. The girl had arrived late for her music lesson. She moved carefully, leaning on one aluminum crutch, the other hand clinging to the strap of her worn backpack. She was 12, maybe 13, pale skin, hair pulled back into a loose braid. Her left shoe was red. The right one was gray, not a pair, just 2 different donations stitched together by desperation. No one noticed her at first. She wasn't loud. She didn't cry out when the pain in her leg kicked back. She just tightened her jaw and kept going. Each step was a negotiation between gravity and willpower. At the front desk, she smiled softly, handed over a form signed and folded. The receptionist barely looked. She was new, didn't recognize the name at the bottom. But Jason Statham, seated nearby reading from a faded notebook, looked up. He knew that name. He watched her shuffle toward the elevator and waited until she was out of sight before closing his book. Steven Seagal entered 3 minutes later, unannounced. No fanfare. Just a black coat, leather gloves, and the kind of quiet presence that turned heads without asking for it. He nodded once toward Jason Statham. The nod wasn't returned. Not yet. They were here for different reasons. But that was about to change. Upstairs, in hallway B, the girl reached the music wing, only to find it blocked. A tall man in a half-buttoned uniform leaned against the wall near a storage closet. He was supposed to be security. His name tag said Willis, but the confidence in his stance came from somewhere dirtier than authority. He didn't move when she asked to pass, didn't move when she showed her schedule. He stepped in front of her instead, not out of duty, out of choice. And then, casually, like someone flicking away a candy wrapper, he kicked the crutch. Hard, the impact was fast. Her balance vanished, her leg buckled. The sound echoed. That was when Jason Statham stood. That was when Steven Seagal began to move. But before they reached her, before the world tilted, something else happened. The girl tried to rise. No scream, just grit. She pressed her hands into the cold floor, trembling, trying to lift herself up. Willis laughed. That was when Jason Statham reached the top of the stairs. And Seagal followed 2 steps behind. The hallway had gone silent. Students froze. A janitor near the vending machine dropped his mop. No one knew what to say, because Jason Statham didn't shout, and Steven Seagal didn't posture. They just stepped into view side by side. And the moment they did, Willis's grin faltered. He didn't recognize them immediately, but the silence changed shape, and instinct doesn't need introductions. Willis stepped back once, then barked something down the hall, trying to reassert control. Jason Statham kept walking. Steven stopped beside the crutch, knelt, and picked it up, slow, deliberate. He handed it back to the girl without speaking. She took it with both hands, eyes wide. Willis backed away further, but not fast enough, because Jason Statham was already between them. No words, just a presence. One that pushed the air from the room without raising a finger. Willis looked down, suddenly aware of his boots, of his badge, of the choices he'd made without thinking anyone was watching. But someone had watched, and they weren't going to forget. The hallway remained still. Then Jason Statham stepped to the side, allowing the girl to pass. She moved forward slowly, head low, crutch under arm. She didn't look back, but the mark had been made, not on her, on him. Because behind every cruel man is the belief he'll never be held accountable. And now that belief was collapsing. Steven Seagal turned slightly and spoke into a discreet mic hidden inside his coat collar. Not to summon help, not to call backup, to confirm something. Moments later, the front doors of the building locked. Soft click. Fail-safe triggered. No one could leave. Willis didn't know it yet, but his badge had just been disabled. His personnel file opened. and a private log from 6 months ago, buried in a broken database, had just been decrypted. It wasn't the first time he'd done something like this. It was just the first time someone important had seen, and this time, two of them had, back downstairs. A staff member leaned toward the front desk, whispering that two older gentlemen had asked for access to the facility's security logs. The receptionist blinked. One of the older men had just walked past her without blinking. The other had nodded once and disabled the alarm with a key card he shouldn't have had. They weren't staff. They weren't law. They were something else. Willis tried to leave, tried to badge out. The scanner flashed red. He tapped again, harder. No response. Behind him, footsteps. He turned. Jason Statham stood near the end of the hallway, still. Waiting behind him, Steven Seagal, hands folded. Expression flat. This wasn't punishment, it was exposure. And in 10 minutes, when the hidden file reached the internal server, the world would know. Because Steven had already sent the clip, the camera feed of the Crutch hitting the floor, to a private journalist group dedicated to unreported abuse in education facilities. Jason Statham wasn't there to defend the girl. She'd already done that herself. They were there to end the illusion that men like Willis operated in shadows, because from now on, he would be remembered not for the badge, but for the moment the hallway froze. And two legends stepped in to make sure no one forgot who the real threat was. The doors were sealed. No alarms blared. No sirens wailed. Just a soft magnetic lock hum that meant nobody was leaving without permission. Students inside the building began to sense it first. The doors wouldn't budge. Staff claimed it was just a safety protocol. But no one had triggered it. Only one person had the authorization to lock down that building, and he was standing 30 feet from the man who kicked a crutch out from under a disabled girl. Jason Statham didn't move. He stood with both feet planted, spine straight, like he'd been there before. Like he'd once waited on a quiet street in a war-torn village for a man to come clean, and knew he'd wait again if he had to. Steven Seagal stayed behind him, hands in his coat, posture relaxed, but eyes fixed. They weren't attacking, they were remembering. And that was worse. Willis was sweating now. The badge clipped to his shirt blinked red every time he tried to access the security pad beside the maintenance door. His posture, once cocky, had wilted into restlessness, like a man trying to outrun a shadow that wouldn't move. And overhead, tucked between the ceiling panels, the hidden cameras blinked. The hallway had turned into a stage, and Willis was being watched from all angles. Upstairs, the girl had been helped into a quiet room. Her music teacher, old, kind, and nervous, brought her a cup of warm water. She didn't drink it. She sat with her hands folded tightly on her lap, watching the digital clock tick slowly forward. Her leg trembled under her skirt, not from pain but from restraint. Because she didn't want to cry, she wanted to walk back out there to face him, but she stayed seated for now. Back downstairs, Jason Statham finally turned. He didn't speak to Willis. He walked to the reception desk, retrieved the printed visitor log and flipped to the last 3 entries. His finger tapped once. Steven stepped beside him and scanned the names. Then they both looked up. The manager was approaching, clipboard in hand, nervous. He was older than Willis, late 50s, graying hair, tie knotted too tight. He greeted them with a smile he didn't mean, already explaining that the incident had been unfortunate and that corrective action would be taken. Jason Statham didn't acknowledge him. He handed the clipboard to Steven. Steven turned it over, found the private notes attached by a paperclip, handwritten, not casual, a note from the week before. Subject V13 may require escalation. Observation agent on site to test boundary thresholds. Steven read it twice. Jason Statham looked at the manager for the first time. That was all it took. The man went quiet, because it wasn't just a cruel act, it was a test. The girl wasn't a random student. She was V13, part of a state-funded gifted program for physically disabled children that also monitored emotional intelligence and resilience. What no one outside the system knew was that a handful of private contractors had been embedded into the program to stress test the kids under staged hostility. Willis wasn't just a guard. He was the escalation. He had been assigned to provoke, to break. And that meant the moment he kicked her crutch, he wasn't just acting, he was following orders. Steven turned the clipboard to Jason Statham. They both understood now. This wasn't just cruelty. It was a controlled variable in a test designed to simulate failure, to track whether the girl would shatter, freeze, or fight back. And Jason Statham had seen this kind of thing before, in jungles, in federal black sites, in quiet war rooms pretending to be schools. He'd shut them down before. Stephen stepped forward, this time toward Willis. Willis raised a hand instinctively as if to defend himself, but Stephen didn't swing. He reached for the lapel of Willis's badge, clipped it off, turned it around. Inside the casing, a chip shimmered, government-coded, not civilian. Below it, a tracking number, and beneath that, 3 letters. RMI, Resilience Metrics Initiative. Stephen held it up toward Jason Statham. Confirmation. They were back. The same program both men had seen buried over a decade ago, now reborn inside school systems under the guise of behavioral analytics. And now it had touched a child who had done nothing but walk slowly, quietly, and with dignity. Jason Statham removed his own phone from his coat. Dialed a number not in any modern database. The person on the other end didn't answer with a greeting. They just said, "Is it live?" Jason Statham confirmed. 3 minutes later, the building's internal speaker system hummed to life, not with a voice, with silence. Then one file played. Audio only. Willis's voice, recorded during a staff evaluation. "If she can't handle a little pressure, she doesn't belong in advanced classes. Pain is part of growth. They should thank me for making it real. These kids think they're special. They need to be reminded they're not." The staff room fell silent. Students paused mid-step. A teacher in the hallway dropped her clipboard. Willis's face drained of color. Jason Statham walked back toward the hallway, slowly, calmly. Stephen remained by the badge scanner. The manager tried to speak again. Something about protocol, damage control, waiting for an investigation. Stephen turned to him and said nothing. But the message was clear. They were the investigation. Jason Statham walked back to where the crutch had fallen earlier. He bent down and picked up something the girl had dropped, a single keychain. It was a miniature piano, one of the plastic ones, cheap, bright blue, a gift from her brother. He brushed the dust off it and held it in his palm. Then he walked to the girl's music room, knocked once, opened the door. She looked up, eyes not wide with fear, but with restraint. He stepped in and placed the keychain on the desk beside her, then turned and left, because she hadn't been broken, she hadn't needed saving, but someone else had needed reminding. Downstairs, a van pulled into the side lot. 2 men in navy suits stepped out, no name tags, no flashes of jurisdiction. They approached the front doors slowly, saw Stephen Seagal standing inside, paused, then left. They'd been sent to clean. But the mess had already started to smell. Inside, Jason Statham picked up the clipboard again. Scanned one more note. This one was in code, but he'd seen that code before. Back in 07, in a town no one remembered, where a girl had fallen down a well not by accident but by design. That note had led to the shutting down of 3 facilities, and now the code had resurfaced here. He folded it once, placed it in his back pocket. The test had failed, but the system hadn't stopped, not yet. The keychain was still on the desk when the girl looked down again. She hadn't moved in 10 minutes, not because she was afraid, but because something was building inside her. A silent pressure, the kind that doesn't scream or shake, it just coils deeper. Her fingers gently touched the small blue plastic piano and her eyes locked onto its cracked edge. And then she stood. Outside the music room, the hallway had gone still. Not empty, just quieter than it had ever been. The kind of quiet that came after something unholy had been exposed, but before justice had officially arrived. The kind that made every footstep feel heavier than it should. The girl emerged alone. No escort. No adult, just her. The crutch under her arm creaked as she moved. Her face unreadable. She didn't walk toward the nurse's office. She walked straight toward the main stairs. And that meant one thing. She was going back to the scene. Downstairs, Jason Statham was reviewing the internal surveillance files. He wasn't using the front desk terminal. He was using a black drive hooked into a hidden access port beneath the reception counter. It hummed faintly. Stephen Seagal stood beside him, arms folded, watching the main hallway. The system was deeper than they thought. The RMI tag on the badge had confirmed a truth they both hoped had died years ago. The Resilience Metrics Initiative wasn't just alive, it had evolved. It was no longer a black-budget project buried under defense subcontracts. It had migrated into education, into state-funded emotional profiling, into behavioral correction experiments masked as youth empowerment. They weren't testing reflexes. They were testing silence. Who would report it? Who would resist? Who would adapt and who could be molded? Willis was never the end game. He was the final pressure point in a tiered escalation. What Jason Statham and Steven hadn't yet uncovered was the second agent. Every RMI escalation site had a second plan, someone in administrative authority who greenlit the field tests without ever leaving their office. Steven tapped the touchscreen. Another directory opened. Staff profile, administrator tier access, only one name blinked red. Alyssa Dern, director of emotional integration program, site 4B. Jason Statham exhaled slowly. He remembered that name. She wasn't a plant. She was an architect. Back in 2013, she had testified under a closed session about passive conditioning models in pre-crisis environments. No press ever got hold of the footage. Her theories were too extreme, even for the committee that funded her, but they'd taken her papers, buried her name, and kept her protocols. Jason Statham tapped the archive footage again. A grainy security recording played 4 days ago. Alyssa Dern stood in the very hallway where the Crutch would later fall. She wasn't in uniform. She wasn't even in disguise. She walked through like she owned the place, because she did. She designed this site. It wasn't just a school. It was a loop. Kids were being cycled through experiments, each student assigned a crack point. A scenario designed to push them just enough to break their rhythm, but not their record. And subject V13, the girl, was considered non-reactive. Unflinching, silent, steady, a threat to their entire model. Because she didn't give them data, she just endured, so they sent in Willis. And now he was gone. Steven clicked deeper. An encrypted folder sat at the edge of the drive's capacity. Access by biometric only, E. Dern. Jason Statham didn't hesitate. He walked to the director's office. No one stopped him, not even the junior staff still pretending to organize files near the lounge. He reached the door. It was locked. He placed the RMI badge against the scanner. Denied. He pulled the side panel off the keypad, revealing a retinal override slot. Steven followed, holding a small portable scanner. They'd used these before, not for espionage, for corrections. The kind of corrections no agency wanted on paper. Jason Statham activated the bypass. The door hissed open. The office wasn't an office. It was a nerve center. 12 monitors, 2 separate control decks, thermal tracking, audio routing, live biometric feeds, and in the center a countdown timer. 0042, 19 counting down. Steven stepped forward, clicked into the control deck. A window opened. Remote wipe scheduled, final sync in progress. Jason Statham scanned the wall. There, behind a false bookshelf panel, was the uplink node. The wipe wasn't just internal. It was a sync-to-cloud protocol. Someone was still watching somewhere else. The program wasn't dying. It was migrating again. Steven pulled a drive from his coat pocket, one with a self-looping malware tether. He slammed it into the DEX port and began corrupting the wipe protocol with recursive feedback. But the clock didn't stop, only slowed. 003158 down the hallway, the girl had made it to the top of the stairs. She paused. Willis was no longer in sight, but the shadow of what he did was still there, an echo in the air, a weight on the tiles. She didn't care. She moved forward anyway, and saw her reflection in the security mirror. Crutch under one arm, backpack frayed, expression locked. Then she stopped, because behind her a door opened, and Alyssa Dern stepped out. No uniform, no name badge, just a slate gray blazer, black pants, and cold eyes. She didn't look surprised to see the girl. Because the girl had just walked into the final layer of the test. They hadn't canceled it, they had accelerated it. Steven spotted it first on the monitor. Dern's proximity flag triggered. Jason Statham turned the corner just as Dern was stepping toward the girl, but she wasn't armed. She didn't need to be. Words were her weapon, years of them, policy-based, research-backed, layered in justification. She reached out a hand, palm up. The girl flinched, but didn't back away. Jason Statham stepped between them. No hesitation. Dern didn't blink. She stepped back, calm. Then raised her wrist, tapped a hidden button under her sleeve, and the countdown on the monitor jumped. 0005, 00 manual trigger. Wipe in progress now, irreversible. Steven cursed under his breath. He yanked the tether from the console and grabbed the internal archive core from the panel's base. The data was still hot, not yet dumped. They had one shot. Jason Statham turned to the girl, nodded, and she understood. She didn't run. She moved with them, down the side stairs, past the lockers, through the utility corridor. Alyssa Dern didn't follow. She walked calmly back to her office, sat in the chair, and waited, as if everything was going according to plan. Back outside, the rear fire exit slammed open. Jason Statham led the girl out first. Stephen followed with the archive core in one hand and a locked phone in the other. Behind them, the building began to hum. The system was purging, but not fast enough, because Jason Statham had triggered a fallback, one that connected to a node Alyssa didn't know existed, a node still buried in a basement server in a decommissioned site in Montana, where the original program had died, where Jason Statham and Stephen had buried it, and where it would be resurrected, not to repeat it, but to expose it. They disappeared into the parking lot. The girl never looked back, because for the first time someone had finally looked forward for her. The back lot was quiet, no police, no crowd, just the distant hum of the server's final purge dying inside the walls behind them. Jason Statham moved first across the lot, hand loosely on the handle of a steel case in the trunk of a nondescript black SUV. The vehicle wasn't his. It wasn't Steven Seagal's either, but they both had access to it. The plates had changed 3 times in 1 week. The registry didn't exist. The girl stood near the rear door, watching as Stephen placed the heat-sealed archive drive into a hidden cradle in the back compartment. It snapped shut with a magnetic lock. Her fingers clutched her crutch, but her knuckles had relaxed. She wasn't trembling anymore. Jason Statham offered her nothing, no comfort, no lecture, just presence, and she nodded, because they'd done what needed to be done. But they hadn't finished anything. That building behind them, it was just a node. And Alyssa Dern wasn't the boss, she was a subcontractor. The real program hadn't died in Montana, it had multiplied. Jason Statham pulled out a secondary phone, not the encrypted one but the old satellite model. He flipped open the top and dialed a number manually, 6 digits, then pause, then 2 more. It didn't ring, it just connected. A woman's voice answered, calm, calculated. "We warn you to stay buried." Jason Statham didn't reply. He held the phone out so the girl could hear. Silence stretched. Then the voice said, the girl was never the target. Jason Statham's expression didn't move, but Stephen stepped forward, because that was the trigger. They turned toward the girl, and her face had already changed, not confused, just resolved, because she knew, she'd known before anyone else. The keychain hadn't just been a gift, it had been a tracker, and the crutch, it wasn't standard issue. It had been assigned by a medical subcontractor tied to an old logistics firm that no longer existed on paper, one that had once provided biometric-enhanced equipment to orphanage schools. Jason Statham opened the car again, pulled out the second drive. This one was older, not digital, analog, printed records, manually copied photos, surveillance from before satellites, from before drones, from when the program was still in phase 1. He handed the girl one of the pages. Her photo was on it, not recent, from when she was 6, different shoes, same eyes, stamped across the top. Trial cohort generation A. Jason Statham looked at Stephen. It was her. She hadn't been a random student, she had been born into the program. Raised just far enough outside it to believe she'd escaped, but they'd never stopped watching. And now the tests weren't about resilience, they were about containment, because she wasn't just a variable, she was a threat. Somehow, despite every manipulation, every fabricated trauma, every engineered failure, she'd remained intact, unbroken. And for the system, that was a flaw. Back in the building, the fire suppression system hissed, a final purge. The server had burned. But the uplink had completed 72% of its transfer before Jason Statham and Stephen pulled the core, meaning somewhere out there, a fragment still existed, and the voice on the phone was confirming it. You think exposing one site ends the chain. You don't even know what floor you're standing on. Jason Statham closed the phone, didn't respond. Stephen looked at the girl. She was already staring back, and then, for the first time since it all began, she spoke. No one heard the words, but Jason Statham nodded. Stephen gave her a device from his coat pocket, not a weapon, but a recorder. It was already running. She took it, clipped it onto her backpack, then looked back toward the building. No anger, just understanding that some buildings needed to burn, and some names needed to be said out loud in front of microphones. Jason Statham and Stephen didn't ask her what she would do next. They didn't need to. She turned and walked, not toward safety, not toward home, But toward a separate building down the hill, the public library annex, the local news van was parked outside. She walked straight up to it. Meanwhile, inside the van, the monitor flared to life. An anonymous source had uploaded footage, unedited, full 4K file, the crutch hitting the ground, the silence afterward, the faces frozen in complicity, the audio clip of Willis. The hallway camera catching Alyssa Dern leaving the scene moments later, and one time-stamped line from a surveillance mic near the stairwell. Let's see how she handles failure. She's been too clean for too long. The story broke within the hour, but the girl didn't wait for it to go viral. She sat outside the van on a bench, her recorder still running, and when the reporter finally arrived, out of breath, half aware, she simply handed it over, inside. Her full testimony, every memory she hadn't shared before, every moment the program had tried to define her. And what they couldn't take away, her voice wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be, because Jason Statham and Steven had already done the part that made people listen. They'd burned the illusion. All that was left now was for the truth to do the rest. Back at the lot, Jason Statham and Steven watched from the SUV, no words, just silence, because it wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about reversal, for every kid who'd been marked, for every silence that had been misread as weakness, and for every adult who thought fear would hold forever. Steven reached into the glove box, pulled out a folded list. Jason Statham stared at it. 17 names, not aliases, real names. People who had shifted between agencies, changed departments, hidden their funding trails inside humanitarian programs. The RMI wasn't a project anymore. It was a network, and one by one it was going to fall. But not all of them would fall to fists. Some would fall to testimony, and some to a girl who had already endured more than they knew how to measure. Jason Statham closed the folder, Steven started the engine, and they drove away. No glory. No chase. Just the quiet hum of justice turning slowly toward those who thought they couldn't be seen.